The dust cloud on the horizon meant trouble, and Preston Eddington knew it the moment he reined his horse to a stop on the ridge overlooking Knights Ferry, California in the autumn of 1873. He had been riding for 3 days straight, his saddlebags holding everything he owned in this world, which wasn't much after the card game in Sacramento had gone sideways. The small mining town below looked peaceful enough in the fading afternoon light, nestled beside the Stanislaus River with its characteristic covered bridge spanning the waters. But Preston had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving. He guided his bay mare down the rocky slope toward the main street, noting the sparse foot traffic and shuttered storefronts that spoke of harder times. The gold rush had passed this region by years ago, leaving behind only stubborn souls who refused to give up on their claims or the businesses that had once thrived on miners' gold. Preston touched the brim of his dusty hat as he passed an elderly woman sweeping her porch, and she responded with a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The Knights Ferry Inn stood at the corner of Main Street and River Road, a 2-story wooden structure that had seen better days. The paint was peeling in places, and one of the shutters hung at an awkward angle, but the porch looked swept and the windows gleamed in the late afternoon sun. Preston tied his horse to the hitching post and stretched his back, feeling every one of his 28 years in his aching muscles. A hot meal and a soft bed were all he wanted right now, and maybe a chance to figure out his next move. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and the smell of fresh bread hit him immediately, making his stomach growl loud enough that he was grateful for the empty lobby. The interior was clean but worn, with furniture that had been mended multiple times and floorboards that bore the scuff marks of countless boots. A desk sat to his right, with a bell and a ledger laid open, but no one attended it. "Be right with you," a woman's voice called from somewhere in the back, strained and breathless. Preston removed his hat and waited, taking in the details of the place. Framed photographs hung on the walls, showing the inn in its glory days with crowds of people on the porch. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold now but clearly well maintained. Everything spoke of someone who cared deeply about this place, despite lacking the resources to keep it perfect. The woman who emerged from the back hallway made Preston forget whatever thoughts he'd been having. She was somewhere in her mid-20s, with dark auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun, though several strands had escaped to frame a face marked by exhaustion and worry. Her green eyes were striking even with the shadows beneath them, and her simple brown dress was worn but clean. She carried a bucket of water that looked far too heavy for her, and Preston instinctively moved forward. "Let me help you with that, madam." She startled slightly, not having expected him to be so close, but gratitude flashed across her features as she allowed him to take the bucket. "Thank you. You can set it just there by the fireplace. I was going to scrub the hearth before evening sets in. Planning to light it tonight." Preston set the bucket down carefully, noting how her shoulders sagged with relief once the weight was gone. "If I can manage it. Gets cold here once the sun goes down." She moved behind the desk with practiced efficiency, brushing those loose strands of hair from her face. "Are you looking for a room?" "Yes, madam. Just for tonight, unless work presents itself." Something shifted in her expression, a flicker of interest mixed with caution. "You looking for work? I'm not running from the law, if that's what you're wondering." Preston offered a small smile. Just a cowboy who found himself between jobs and thought a change of scenery might do him good. She studied him for a long moment, those green eyes assessing. Preston got the feeling she could see right through any lies he might have told, which was fine since he hadn't told any. Finally, she nodded and turned the ledger toward him. "Penelope Jenkins. I own this inn, Inherited it from my father 2 years back. She handed him a pen. Room is 50 cents a night, includes breakfast. Supper is available for an additional 20 cents if you'd like. Preston Eddington, and yes to supper, thank you. He signed the ledger with careful letters, aware of her eyes still on him. Business been slow, Penelope laughed, but there was no humor in it. You could say that. Since the last mine closed 6 months ago, half the town has cleared out. Those that remain don't have much call for in rooms, and travelers are few and far between on this route anymore. Preston looked up from the ledger, hearing something in her voice that went beyond simple financial worry. But you're staying. This inn is all I have left of my father. He built it with his own hands back in '53, when Knights Ferry was booming with miners and merchants. He believed in this town, in this place. Her chin lifted slightly, pride and stubbornness written in every line of her posture. I won't let it die without a fight. There was something about her determination that struck a chord in Preston's chest. He'd spent most of his adult life drifting from one place to another, never putting down roots, never fighting for anything beyond his next meal and a safe place to sleep. The conviction in Penelope Jenkins's voice made him feel suddenly hollow and aimless. That's admirable, Miss Jenkins. It's Mrs. Jenkins, actually, though I'm widowed. She said it matter-of-factly, but Preston caught the brief tightening around her eyes. My husband passed 3 years ago. Accident at the mine. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you. She took a key from a hook on the wall behind her. You're in room 4, top of the stairs and to the right. There's a wash basin and pitcher, and the privy is out back. Supper will be ready in about an hour if you'd like to come down to the dining room. Preston took the key, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. I'll be there, and thank you for your hospitality. He climbed the narrow stairs, each step creaking under his weight, and found room 4 to be small but scrupulously clean. A simple bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand, a chair, and a small table were the only furnishings. The window overlooked Main Street, giving him a view of the quiet town and the mountains beyond. Preston set his saddlebags on the chair and stretched out on the bed, intending to rest his eyes for just a moment. He woke to the smell of cooking meat and the realization that the light outside had faded to dusk. Jumping up, he quickly washed his face and hands in the basin, ran his fingers through his dark hair to make it somewhat presentable, and headed downstairs. The dining room was to the left of the lobby, a modest space with 4 tables covered in simple cloths. Only one other person occupied the room, an older man who nodded at Preston before returning his attention to his plate. Penelope emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 plates, and Preston moved quickly to hold the door for her. She gave him a surprised look, but smiled her thanks as she passed. Sit anywhere you like. I'll bring yours right out. The meal she set before him minutes later was simple but hearty. Roasted chicken, potatoes, carrots, and thick slices of that bread he'd smelled earlier. Preston's mouth watered as he picked up his fork. This looks wonderful, Mrs. Jenkins. I hope it tastes as good as it looks. She hesitated, standing beside his table with her hands clasped in front of her apron. Mr. Eddington, you mentioned you were looking for work. I don't have much, but I could use help around here. The place is falling apart faster than I can fix it, and there's only so much one person can do. Preston swallowed his bite of chicken and looked up at her. In the lamplight, he could see the worry lines on her face more clearly, the way her hands twisted in her apron. This was a proud woman asking for help, and he sensed how much it cost her. What kind of help are you needing? Everything, truthfully. Repairs to the building, maintenance of the rooms, help with the heavier chores. I can't pay much, just room and board and maybe a few dollars a week when guests come through. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the vulnerability underneath. I understand if that's not enough. Most men wouldn't consider it. Preston thought about his empty saddlebags, his lack of prospects, and the aimless drifting that had characterized the last few years of his life. Then he thought about the determination in this woman's eyes, the way she fought for something that mattered to her even when the odds seemed impossible. "I'll take it." Penelope blinked, clearly having expected him to refuse. "You will, on one condition." Preston set down his fork and looked at her directly. "You let me see what needs doing before you pay me anything. I want to know what I'm getting into, and I want you to be satisfied with my work before any money changes hands." "That's very fair, but I should warn you, the list is extensive." She pulled a small notebook from her apron pocket and flipped it open. "The front shutter needs rehinging. 3 of the upstairs window frames are rotting and need replacement. The back porch has loose boards. The privy door won't close properly. Half the roof shingles are loose, and the chimney needs cleaning and repointing. That's just what I can see." "I'm sure there's more." Preston let out a low whistle. "That is extensive. How have you been managing?" "Badly." She closed the notebook with a snap. "I do what I can, but I'm not a carpenter or a roofer. I've been focused on keeping the place clean and the guests fed, but I'm losing ground every day." "Well, let's change that." Preston picked up his fork again, suddenly feeling more energized than he had in months. "I'll start tomorrow morning, first light. Show me where your tools are and what materials you have, and we'll go from there." Relief washed over Penelope's face so completely that Preston felt his chest tighten. When had he last done something that mattered to someone else? When had he last been needed for more than his gun or his ability to sit a horse? "Thank you, Mr. Eddington. You have no idea what this means to me. Call me Preston, please, and I think I might have some idea." He smiled at her, and for the first time since he'd walked through the door, she smiled back without reservation, transforming her tired face into something beautiful. The next morning arrived with a chill in the air that promised an early winter. Preston was up before dawn, dressing quickly and heading downstairs to find Penelope already in the kitchen. She looked startled when he appeared in the doorway. "I didn't expect you quite this early. I haven't finished breakfast yet." "No hurry. I thought I'd take a look around outside while the light's good, get a sense of what we're dealing with." Preston accepted the cup of coffee she poured for him, wrapping his hands around the warm ceramic. "Unless you'd rather show me yourself. Let me finish these biscuits and I'll join you." She moved around the kitchen with economical grace, someone who knew her space intimately. Preston watched her work, noting the way she favored her left hand slightly, a small burned scar visible on her right wrist. 20 minutes later, they stood in the yard behind the inn as the sun began to paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Preston walked the perimeter slowly, testing the porch boards with his weight, examining the foundation, peering up at the roofline. Penelope followed quietly, letting him work, and Preston appreciated that she didn't feel the need to fill the silence with chatter. The picture that emerged was concerning but not hopeless. The structure was fundamentally sound, built by someone who knew what he was doing, but years of deferred maintenance had allowed small problems to become larger ones. With time and effort, it could all be fixed. "Your father knew his craft," Preston said, running his hand along a support beam. "This is solid work. The bones are good. He was a carpenter back in Missouri before he caught gold fever. When that didn't pan out, he went back to what he knew." Penelope touched the wall gently, affection in the gesture. "He used to say a man should build things that outlast him, make a mark on the world that time can't erase so easily." "Sounds like a wise man." "He was. I wish you could have met him." She dropped her hand and turned to face Preston. "So what's the verdict? Is it salvageable?" "Absolutely. It'll take work, and we'll need materials, but none of this is beyond fixing." Preston pulled out the small notebook he kept in his shirt pocket and began making notes. "The roof is the priority. If we don't get that secured before winter rains come, water damage will make everything else worse. After that, the windows and shutters, then we work our way down to the cosmetic issues." Penelope nodded slowly, but he could see worry creeping back into her expression. "The materials will be expensive. I have some savings, but not much. Let me worry about that for now. I have some money set aside, and I know how to stretch a dollar." It wasn't entirely true. His funds were limited, but something about the hope flickering in her eyes made him want to protect it. "Besides, if we're clever about it, we can source a lot of what we need locally. That covered bridge in town, they must have spare timber somewhere, and I bet there are abandoned homesteads in the area we could salvage from. That's resourceful thinking." Penelope's smile returned, smaller but genuine. "Are you sure about this, Preston? It's a lot of work for room, board, and uncertain wages." Preston looked at the inn, at the mountains beyond, at the woman standing beside him with hope and fear warring in her eyes. Something settled in his chest, a feeling of rightness he hadn't experienced in years. "I'm sure. Let's get started." The days that followed fell into a rhythm that Preston found surprisingly satisfying. He rose before dawn, helped Penelope with the heavier morning chores, then worked on repairs until the light failed. She brought him lunch and coffee throughout the day, often staying to hand him tools or hold boards steady while he hammered. They talked as they worked, sharing stories that gradually painted pictures of their respective pasts. Preston learned that Penelope had grown up in Knights Ferry, had married her childhood sweetheart Thomas at 18, and had been widowed by 22. She had no children, a fact she mentioned with a mixture of sadness and resignation. Her father had died 6 months after Thomas, leaving her alone in the world except for the inn in turn. Preston shared carefully edited versions of his own history. He'd grown up on a ranch in Texas, left home at 16 after his father died, and his mother remarried a man who didn't want a grown stepson around. He'd worked as a cowboy, a ranch hand, a guard on wagon trains, moving from place to place without ever finding somewhere that felt like home. "That sounds lonely," Penelope said one afternoon as she held a ladder steady while Preston cleaned leaves from the gutters. "I suppose it was, though I didn't think of it that way at the time. I told myself I was free, unburdened by ties or responsibilities." Preston scooped another handful of rotting leaves and dropped them to the ground. "Now I'm not so sure that was freedom. Maybe it was just running." "Running from what?" Preston paused, considering the question. "From the idea that I might fail at something that mattered. If you never commit to anything, you never have to face the possibility of losing it. But you also never get to experience having it in the first place." Penelope's voice was soft but firm. "I lost Thomas and my father, and yes, it hurt more than I can express. But I wouldn't trade the years I had with them for anything. The love was worth the loss." Preston climbed down the ladder and stood beside her, this woman who had endured so much and still chose hope over bitterness. "You're braver than I am." "I don't think that's true. You're here, aren't you? Helping a stranger rebuild something that might fail anyway. That takes courage." She met his eyes, and Preston felt something shift between them, an awareness that hadn't been there before or perhaps had been there all along but unacknowledged. "It doesn't feel like courage. It feels like the first sensible thing I've done in years." A guest arrived that evening, a traveling salesman named Mr. Harrigan, who was delighted to find the inn open for business. Over supper, he regaled them with stories from his travels, but Preston found his attention repeatedly drawn to Penelope. She was animated in a way he hadn't seen before, clearly energized by having a paying guest to serve. This was what the inn could be. Preston realized what she was fighting to preserve. Not just a building, but a place of warmth and welcome in a harsh world. After Mr. Harrigan retired to his room, Preston helped Penelope clear the dishes. They worked in companionable silence in the kitchen, him washing while she dried and put away. "Thank you for your help with supper," Penelope said, hanging the last plate on its hook. "You didn't have to do that. I don't mind. Besides, you've been helping me all day with the repairs." "Fair is fair." Preston dried his hands on a towel and leaned against the counter. "Can I ask you something, of course? Why is this place so important to you? And I don't mean just because your father built it. There's something more, isn't there?" Penelope was quiet for a long moment, her hands stilling on the dish towel. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "When Thomas died, I fell apart. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't see any reason to keep going. My father brought me back here to the inn, and he put me to work. Cleaning rooms, cooking meals, tending to guests. He told me that sometimes the only way through grief is to be useful, to remember that the world keeps turning and needs us to turn with it." She looked up at Preston, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "This place saved my life. It gave me purpose when I had none. And when my father died, I felt him here in every board and nail. Letting it go would be like losing them both all over again." Preston crossed the small kitchen in 2 steps and pulled her into his arms without thinking. She stiffened for a moment, then melted against him, her head resting on his chest. He could feel her trembling and tightened his hold. "You're not going to lose it," he said firmly. "We're going to fix this place up until it shines. We're going to bring back guests and make it profitable again. I promise you, Penelope, I'm not going anywhere." She pulled back slightly to look up at him, searching his face for something. "Why? You barely know me. Why would you make such a promise?" Preston raised his hand to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. "Because in the week I've been here, I've felt more at home than I have in the last 10 years. Because your courage shames my cowardice. Because when I look at you, I see everything I've been running from and realize it's exactly what I've been running toward all along." Penelope's breath caught, and for a heartbeat, Preston thought she might pull away. Instead, she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his, tentative and questioning. Preston responded gently, one hand sliding to the back of her neck while the other settled on her waist. The kiss was soft and sweet, tasting of the coffee they'd shared after supper and something indefinably Penelope. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "I shouldn't have done that," Penelope whispered, but she made no move to leave his embrace. "Why not?" "Because you'll leave eventually. Everyone does. And I've already lost so much, Preston. I don't think I could bear it if I let myself care for you, and then you disappeared like morning fog." Preston rested his forehead against hers, choosing his words carefully. "I can't promise I'm perfect or that I'll never make mistakes, but I can promise that if I leave, it won't be because I want to. It'll only be if you send me away. Don't make promises you might not keep. I'm not. Penelope, look at me." He waited until her eyes met his. "I've been drifting for years, looking for something I couldn't name. I think I was looking for this, for you. For a reason to stop running and start building something that matters. It's only been a week," she said, but there was hope in her voice now, fragile and nascent. "I know. I'm not asking for forever tonight, I'm just asking for a chance. Let me stay, let me help, and let's see where this goes. Can you do that?" Penelope studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I can do that, but Preston, if you hurt me, I'll shoot you with my father's rifle." He laughed, relieved and delighted by her spirit. "That's fair. I'd expect nothing less." They kissed again, longer this time, and when they finally parted, Penelope's cheeks were flushed and her eyes sparkled with something other than tears. She stepped back, smoothing her apron in a gesture Preston was beginning to recognize as her way of regaining composure. "It's late. We should both get some rest. Tomorrow is Sunday, and I'll need to prepare a good breakfast for Mr. Harrigan before church services. Do you attend the church here in town when I can? The Reverend is a kind man, and the community needs all the support it can get these days." She paused at the kitchen door. "Would you like to come with me?" Preston hadn't been to church in years, but the invitation in her eyes was impossible to refuse. "I'd like that." Sunday morning dawned clear and cool. Preston wore his cleanest shirt and pants, brushed his hat until it looked almost respectable, and met Penelope in the lobby. She wore a deep blue dress that brought out the green in her eyes, and her hair was arranged in an elegant twist that made his fingers itch to pull out the pins. The church was a simple white building at the edge of town, its bell tower visible from the inn. About 30 people gathered for the service, mostly older folks and a few families with young children. Preston felt their curious eyes on him as he and Penelope took a seat near the back, and he was aware of the whispers that followed. Reverend Samuel Worth was indeed a kind man, his sermon focusing on perseverance and faith in difficult times. Preston found himself actually listening, the words resonating in unexpected ways. When the service ended, several people approached to introduce themselves, their questions about Preston politely veiled but unmistakable. Who was this stranger, and what was his relationship with Penelope Jenkins? "Preston is helping with repairs at the inn," Penelope explained to Mrs. Harrington, the elderly woman who ran the general store. "He's been an absolute godsend." "I'm sure he has, dear." Mrs. Harrington's shrewd eyes assessed Preston. "We've all been worried about you trying to manage that big place on your own. It's good you have help." They walked back to the inn slowly, enjoying the autumn sunshine. Preston noticed how Penelope nodded and smiled at everyone they passed, even those who didn't acknowledge her in return. She was part of this community's fabric, woven into its history and daily life. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Preston asked as they turned onto Main Street. "Starting fresh somewhere else where no one knows your story?" "Sometimes," Penelope admitted. "Especially in the depths of winter when money is tight and the memories feel heavy. But then spring comes, or I see the sunset over the mountains, or someone tells me how much they appreciated my father's kindness years ago, and I remember why I stay. This is my home, Preston, for better or worse. I understand that now. I never had that feeling about any place before, but I'm starting to hear." She smiled up at him, and Preston felt his heart skip. How had this happened so quickly? How had this woman become so important to him in just over a week? Yet he couldn't deny the truth of it. Penelope Jenkins had somehow slipped past all his defenses and made herself essential. The next weeks passed in a blur of activity. Preston rose early each morning to work on the most pressing repairs. He patched the roof, replacing shingles and sealing leaks before the autumn rains arrived. He rebuilt the back porch, salvaging good lumber from an abandoned homestead Penelope knew about. He fixed windows, rehung shutters, and even managed to improve the privy situation considerably. Through it all, Penelope worked alongside him when she could, learning skills she'd never had opportunity to develop. Preston taught her to hammer nails straight, to saw boards clean, to mix mortar for the chimney repairs. She was a quick student, and he found himself looking for excuses to stand close, to guide her hands with his, to breathe in the scent of lavender soap that clung to her hair. In the evenings, they sat together in the dining room or the small parlor, talking about everything and nothing. Preston learned about Penelope's childhood, her dreams of travel that had never materialized, her talent for baking that came from her mother's recipes. She learned about his years as a cowboy, the vast spaces of Texas and Wyoming, the loneliness that had driven him from place to place like tumbleweeds in the wind. They were careful around their growing feelings, neither quite ready to voice what was becoming obvious. But the touches lingered longer. The looks held more heat, and when Preston lay in his bed at night, he thought about Penelope in her room down the hall and wondered if she was thinking about him too. A month after Preston's arrival, the first real test came. 3 men rode into town at dusk, rough-looking characters with hard eyes and guns worn low on their hips. They tied their horses in front of the inn and walked in like they owned the place. Preston was in the dining room, helping Penelope set tables for the next day, when they entered. "Well now, what do we have here?" The leader was a tall man with a scar running down his left cheek, his grin revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Pretty little innkeeper all alone. That's no way to live, darling." Penelope's spine straightened, her chin lifting in that way Preston recognized as stubbornness wrapped in fear. "Good evening, gentlemen. If you're looking for rooms, I'm afraid I'm full for the night." "That right?" Scarface looked around the empty lobby with exaggerated surprise. "Don't look full to me. In fact, looks downright empty." Preston stepped forward from the dining room, letting his presence be known. "The lady said she's full. Maybe you could try the next town over." The 3 men turned as one, their attention focusing on Preston with predatory interest. Scarface's grin widened. "Well, well, the little innkeeper has a guard dog. That's sweet, ain't it, boys? Real sweet," one of the others agreed, a short, stocky man with a face like a bulldog. "Look, nobody wants trouble here." Preston kept his voice calm, his hands visible and away from the gun he'd strapped on out of habit that morning. "It's getting dark, and there's a good inn about 10 miles north. I'm sure they'd be happy to have your business. But we like it here." Scarface moved closer, and Preston could smell the whiskey on his breath. "This place has got character, and that pretty innkeeper, she's got something special too. Maybe we'll just stay and enjoy the hospitality whether we're invited or not." Preston's jaw tightened. Behind him, he could feel Penelope's fear, and it lit something protective and fierce in his chest. "That's not going to happen." "You planning to stop us, cowboy?" The 3rd man, lean and wiry with a nervous energy, had his hand resting on his gun. "There's 3 of us and 1 of you. Odds ain't exactly in your favor." "Maybe not, but I'm betting I can take at least 2 of you before you get me. Question is, which 2? Preston's voice dropped lower, harder. "Are you willing to find out?" Silence stretched taut as a wire. Preston watched Scarface's eyes, seeing the calculation there. These men were bullies and thieves, but they weren't stupid. A fight here would bring attention they probably didn't want, and the risk of getting shot, even if they won, wasn't worth whatever they might gain from robbing a struggling inn. "Ain't worth it," Scarface finally said, spitting on the floor in a gesture of contempt. "This place is dying anyway. Come on, boys. Let's find somewhere that appreciates our business." They left with exaggerated slowness, making sure everyone knew they were choosing to go rather than being forced. Preston didn't relax until he heard their horses riding away, the sound fading into the distance. Only then did he turn to find Penelope gripping the edge of the desk, her knuckles white. "Are you all right?" He was beside her in an instant, hands on her shoulders. "I'm fine, just shaken." She looked up at him, eyes wide. "Preston, you could have been killed. There were 3 of them." "But I wasn't, and neither were you. That's what matters." He pulled her close, feeling her heart racing against his chest. "I meant what I said, Penelope. I'm not letting anything happen to you or this inn." She wrapped her arms around his waist and held on tight. "I was so scared. Not just for me, but for you. When that man put his hand on his gun, I thought. Her voice broke. Hey, look at me. Preston tilted her chin up, needing her to see the truth in his eyes. I'm fine, we're fine, and those cowards won't be coming back. How can you be sure? Because men like that are all bluster. They pick on people they think are weak and alone. But you're not alone anymore, Penelope. You have me, and I'm not going anywhere. She searched his face, and whatever she saw there made her eyes fill with tears. Preston Eddington, what am I going to do with you? Love me if you can. Because I'm already halfway gone over you, and I figure we might as well fall together. The words were out before he could stop them. Raw and honest, Penelope drew in a sharp breath. Preston, I know it's fast. I know we've only known each other a month, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. I love you, Penelope Jenkins. I love your strength and your kindness. I love the way you fight for what matters and refuse to give up even when any sane person would. I love how you make me want to be better, to build instead of drift, to plant roots instead of running. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she was smiling. I love you too. I think I have since you took that bucket from me on your first day here. You saw me, Preston, not just the innkeeper or the widow, but me. And you stayed when anyone else would have left. He kissed her then, pouring all his feelings into it, and she responded with equal fervor. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Preston rested his forehead against hers. Marry me. Penelope laughed, the sound slightly hysterical. Now. Well, not this instant, but soon. Marry me, Penelope. Let me be your partner in truth, not just in name. Let me help you save this inn and build a life here together. Yes. She didn't hesitate, didn't equivocate. Yes, Preston, I'll marry you. They told Reverend Worth the next day, and he agreed to perform the ceremony the following Sunday. The town buzzed with gossip, some of it kind and some less so. A few people whispered that Penelope was moving too fast, that she barely knew this drifter who'd wandered into town. But more were supportive, happy to see the young widow finding love again, grateful that the inn might survive after all. Mrs. Harrington from the general store took Penelope under her wing, helping her prepare for the simple ceremony. Preston used some of his dwindling funds to buy a new shirt and have his boots polished. He felt nervous in a way he never had facing down angry cattle or dangerous men, terrified that something would go wrong and snatch this happiness away. The morning of the wedding dawned cloudy and cold, threatening rain. Preston stood at the church altar, Reverend Worth beside him, watching the door and praying Penelope would appear. When she did, his breath caught. She wore a dress of cream-colored wool, borrowed from a friend, with her auburn hair arranged in soft curls around her face. She carried a small bouquet of late-season wildflowers, and her smile could have lit the entire town. The ceremony was simple and brief. They spoke their vows in strong, clear voices, promising to love and cherish each other through whatever came. When Reverend Worth pronounced them husband and wife, Preston kissed his bride with such enthusiasm that the small gathered crowd laughed and applauded. The celebration afterward at the inn was modest but joyful. The townsfolk had contributed what they could, food and drink shared communally. Someone produced a fiddle, and there was dancing in the dining room that had been cleared of furniture. Preston waltzed with his new wife, neither of them particularly skilled but both radiantly happy. Happy, Mrs. Eddington, Preston murmured in her ear as they swayed to the music. Happier than I ever thought I'd be again. Penelope looked up at him with such love that Preston felt his heart might burst. You're the partner I always needed, Preston, the one I didn't dare hope I'd find. I'm the lucky one. He kissed her temple, holding her close. You gave me a home, Penelope. You gave me a purpose and a reason to stop running. You gave me everything. As the autumn afternoon faded into evening, the celebration wound down. Guests departed with well wishes and knowing smiles, leaving Preston and Penelope alone in their inn. They climbed the stairs hand in hand, entering Penelope's room, which was now theirs to share. "Nervous?" Preston asked, seeing the flutter of her pulse at her throat. "A little. It's been a long time since Thomas, and even then we were both so young and uncertain." She smiled ruefully. "I'm not that same girl anymore." "I'm glad you're not. I love the woman you are now." Preston began carefully removing the pins from her hair, watching it tumble down around her shoulders. "We'll go slow. There's no rush. We have the rest of our lives." What followed was tender and passionate, a joining that was both physical and spiritual. Preston took his time learning what made his wife gasp and sigh, and she did the same, both of them creating something new together. Afterward, they lay tangled in the sheets, Penelope's head on Preston's chest and his arms around her, and Preston felt peace settle over him like a warm blanket. "I never want to leave this moment," Penelope whispered into the darkness. "Then let's stay here forever." Preston kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her. "Just you and me and this life we're building. That sounds perfect." Winter arrived in full force, bringing with it cold winds and freezing rain that tested every repair Preston had made. But the roof held, the windows stayed snug, and the inn remained warm thanks to the chimney he'd repointed and the fires he kept burning. Business picked up slightly as travelers sought refuge from the weather, and Penelope's excellent cooking and Preston's friendly demeanor earned them a reputation for hospitality. They worked side by side through those winter months, Preston taking on odd jobs around town to supplement their income while continuing to improve the inn. He fixed Mrs. Harrington's back steps and repaired a wagon for the blacksmith. Word spread that he was reliable and skilled, and the work kept coming, never enough to make them rich but sufficient to keep food on the table and the inn solvent. Through it all, their love deepened. They learned each other's rhythms and habits, the small irritations and larger joys of sharing life with another person. Preston discovered that Penelope was grumpy in the mornings until she'd had her coffee, that she hummed while she cooked, and that she had a surprisingly bawdy sense of humor. Penelope learned that Preston had nightmares sometimes about his rootless years, that he could fix almost anything with enough time and patience, and that he showed love through action more than words. By spring, Penelope suspected she was pregnant. She waited until she was certain before telling Preston, choosing a morning when the first wildflowers were blooming and the air smelled of renewal. They were working in the garden behind the inn, turning over soil for vegetables, when she set down her spade and touched his arm. "Preston, I need to tell you something." He looked up, immediately attentive to the serious note in her voice. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I'm fine. Better than fine, actually." She took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby." Preston's eyes widened, his face cycling through shock, disbelief, and finally pure joy. "A baby, are you sure?" "As sure as I can be without the doctor's confirmation, but I know my body, Preston. There's a child growing inside me, our child." He pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around. When he set her down, his eyes were bright with tears. "A baby, we're going to be parents. Penelope, I don't even know what to say. Say you're happy." "I'm ecstatic. Terrified, but ecstatic." He cupped her face, his expression solemn. "I'm going to be a father. I swear to you, Penelope, I'm going to be a good one. Our child will never doubt they're loved and wanted." "I know." She covered his hands with hers. "You're going to be an amazing father, Preston. I've watched you with the children who come through the inn. You're patient and kind, and you listen to them like they matter. They do matter, and our child will matter more than anything." He kissed her softly. "Thank you for this gift, Penelope. Thank you for choosing me." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through spring and into summer. Penelope bloomed with it, her skin glowing and her energy boundless despite the growing life inside her. Preston became almost comically protective, insisting she rest more and lift less, hovering like an anxious mother hen until Penelope shooed him away with affectionate exasperation. The inn prospered as warmer weather brought more travelers. Word had spread about the quality of the accommodations and the warmth of the welcome, and they found themselves with a steady stream of guests. Preston expanded his repair work, taking jobs throughout the county, and earning enough that they could hire a young woman named Sarah to help Penelope with the housework. By the time autumn returned, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Penelope was heavily pregnant and ready to meet their child. The baby came on a crisp October evening, arriving with the speed of a summer storm after a labor that lasted only a few hours. Preston paced the hallway outside their bedroom, listening to the sounds within and praying harder than he ever had in his life. When the midwife finally opened the door, she was smiling. "You have a son, Mr. Eddington, a healthy boy with a good set of lungs." Preston rushed inside to find Penelope propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, cradling a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "Preston, meet your son." He approached slowly, almost reverently, and peered down at the scrunched red face of his child. The baby's eyes were screwed shut, and one tiny fist waved in the air as if already fighting the world. Preston felt something crack open in his chest, a well of love so profound it was almost painful. "He's perfect." Preston's voice was rough with emotion. "Absolutely perfect. You want to hold him?" Preston nodded, unable to speak, and Penelope carefully transferred the baby into his arms. The weight was slight, but somehow monumental, the responsibility of this tiny life settling onto Preston's shoulders like a mantle. The baby squirmed, then settled, one miniature hand grasping Preston's finger with surprising strength. "Hello, son. I'm your papa." Preston blinked back tears. "I promise I'm going to do right by you. I'm going to teach you to be strong and kind, to build things that last, to fight for what matters. And I'm going to make sure you always know you're loved." "What should we name him?" Penelope asked, watching her husband and son with soft eyes. Preston thought about his father, the good man who died too young. Peter Robert Eddington, after my father and yours, Peter." Penelope tested the name and smiled. "It's perfect. Hello, Peter. Welcome to the world, little one." The months that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and overwhelming joy. Peter was a good baby, healthy and curious, and watching him grow became the highlight of Preston and Penelope's days. The inn continued to thrive, and Preston's reputation as a skilled worker spread throughout the region. They were making not just a living but a life, building something solid and good. One evening in late spring, as Peter napped in a cradle Preston had built and Penelope prepared supper, Preston found himself standing in the doorway of the inn, looking out at the town. The covered bridge crossed the river in the distance, and the mountains rose beyond, eternal and unchanging. He thought about the man he'd been when he rode into Knights Ferry nearly 2 years ago, aimless and hollow, running from himself. That man was gone, replaced by someone he barely recognized. A husband, a father, a member of a community, a man with roots. Penelope came up behind him, slipping her arm around his waist. "What are you thinking about?" "About how lost I was before I found you." Preston pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. "About how this place saved me just like it saved you." "We saved each other," Penelope corrected gently. I couldn't have kept the inn without you, Preston. I was drowning and you threw me a rope, but you also let me throw one back to you. You're right. He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. We're partners in the truest sense. Equal and balanced. You're the partner I always needed, Penelope said, echoing the words she'd spoken on their wedding day. The one who sees me as I am and loves me anyway. The one who stays. Always, Preston promised, sealing it with a kiss. I'm never leaving, Penelope. This is my home now. You and Peter and this inn and this town. This is where I belong. 2 years later, Peter had a sister named Pauline, who arrived with much less drama than her brother and proceeded to wrap her father completely around her tiny finger. The inn was not just solvent but successful, a hub for travelers passing through the region and a point of pride for Knights Ferry. Preston had become a respected member of the community, serving on the town council and helping to organize efforts to improve the infrastructure and attract new businesses. On their 4th wedding anniversary, Preston and Penelope stood on the newly rebuilt front porch of the inn, watching their children play in the yard. Peter, nearly 3, was showing his baby sister a bug he'd found, his chatter an unceasing stream of observations and questions. Pauline gurgled happily, more interested in her brother than the insect. Can you believe this is our life? Penelope leaned against Preston's shoulder, contentment radiating from her. Sometimes I have to pinch myself to make sure I'm not dreaming. If you are, then we're sharing the same dream. Preston wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her closer. And I never want to wake up. Do you ever miss it? The wandering, the freedom of the road? Preston considered the question seriously. Sometimes I miss the simplicity of it, not having responsibilities beyond myself. But what I have now is so much richer, so much more meaningful. I'd choose this life 1,000 times over, even with all the work and worry, especially with all the work and worry. He turned to face her fully. Penelope, you gave me something to fight for, something to build. You made me into the man I always wanted to be but never knew how. And these children, our inn, this community we've helped strengthen, all of it matters in a way nothing in my old life ever did. Penelope smiled, that beautiful expression that still made his heart skip. You did the same for me. You reminded me that life doesn't end with loss, that there's always room for new chapters and fresh starts. You gave me hope when I had none left. Peter came running over, his bug forgotten. Papa, up! Preston scooped his son into his arms, settling him on his hip. What is it, buddy? Tell story. About you and Mama. It had become Peter's favorite bedtime story, the tale of how his parents met. Preston looked at Penelope, who smiled and nodded. Well, it starts with a dusty cowboy riding into town, tired and lost and looking for somewhere to rest. Preston began, his voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller. He found an inn run by the bravest, most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, and she needed help. So he stayed and he worked, and somewhere along the way he fell in love. And Mama fell in love too, Peter added, already knowing the story by heart. That's right. Your Mama fell in love too, and they got married and had a son named Peter and a daughter named Pauline, and they lived happily right here in this inn, taking care of travelers and each other. Happily ever after, Peter concluded with satisfaction. Happily ever after, Preston agreed, meeting Penelope's eyes over their son's head. As the sun set over Knights Ferry, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the Eddington family stood together on their porch. The inn that Penelope's father had built with his own hands stood solid and strong, its paint fresh and its roof sound. Inside, the smell of supper cooking wafted through open windows, and lamplight glowed warm and welcoming. This was what home looked like, Preston thought. Not a place but people, Not walls, but love. It was in Penelope's smile and Peter's laughter and Pauline's happy coos. It was in the satisfaction of a hard day's work and the peace of evening's arrival. It was in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new challenges but also new joys, and that he wouldn't face any of it alone. "I love you," Preston said to his wife, the words as true as the first time he'd spoken them. "I love you too." Penelope kissed him softly, then pulled back with a mischievous smile. "Now come help me get these children fed and bathed. Partnership means sharing all the duties. Remember." Preston laughed and followed his family inside, the door closing behind them on a scene of domestic happiness. The inn stood solid through another night, sheltering travelers and the family who'd brought it back to life, a testament to the power of love, hard work, and the courage to stop running and start building. Years continued to pass in Knights Ferry, each season bringing its own rhythms and rewards. The town slowly grew as word spread about the opportunities in the area. A new mine opened in the hills, operated with more modern techniques than the old gold rush claims, and brought an influx of workers and their families. The covered bridge was reinforced and expanded. New businesses appeared along Main Street, filling the gaps left by those who departed during the hard years. Through it all, the Knights Ferry Inn remained a constant, its reputation for comfort and hospitality spreading far beyond the immediate region. Preston and Penelope worked tirelessly, but it no longer felt like desperation. They had help now. Sarah still with them but joined by a young man named Thomas, whom Preston trained in carpentry and maintenance, and another woman who helped in the kitchen during busy seasons. Peter grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved working alongside his father, learning to use tools and fix things almost before he could read. Pauline was her mother's shadow, helping in the kitchen and charming guests with her sunny disposition. When Peter was 6 and Pauline 4, they were joined by twin boys, James and Joseph, who arrived dramatically during a thunderstorm and proceeded to turn the household upside down with their boundless energy. Preston sometimes joked that he'd gone from having nothing to having everything, and it felt like the literal truth. His days were full of noise and chaos, of laughter and occasional tears, of work that mattered and love that sustained. He'd become the man he'd once thought he could never be: rooted, responsible, essential. On a summer evening when Peter was 10 and already almost to Preston's shoulder, the family gathered on the porch after supper as was their custom. The twins were playing with wooden horses Preston had carved, Pauline was reading a book, and Peter sat beside his father, studying a drawing he'd made of a new addition to the inn they'd been planning. "What do you think, Papa? If we extend the dining room here, we could add 4 more tables." Preston examined the drawing, impressed by his son's attention to detail. "That's smart thinking, Peter, but we'd need to reinforce this wall here to handle the extra weight. See how it's load-bearing." They bent over the plans together, discussing possibilities and problems, while Penelope watched with a smile. She'd been watching Preston with their children for years now, and it never ceased to move her how patient and engaged he was. He'd kept every promise he'd made that day in the garden when she'd told him about Peter, becoming the father he'd vowed to be. "Mama, can we have pie?" Pauline looked up from her book with hopeful eyes. "After you finish that chapter, then we'll all have pie together." The simple domestic exchange was so ordinary, so beautifully mundane, that Preston felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. This was the life he'd never dared dream of, the one he'd thought was reserved for better men. Yet here it was, his to live and cherish. Later that night, after the children were asleep and the inn was quiet, Preston and Penelope sat together in their bedroom, reviewing the accounts. The numbers were good, better than they'd been in all the years since Penelope's father had died. They were not just surviving, but thriving. "We could expand," Penelope said, tapping the ledger with her pen. "Build that addition Peter drew up, maybe even add a second building out back for longer-term guests. The demand is there." "Do you want to?" Preston studied her face, trying to read her thoughts. "Your father built this place to a specific size for a reason. Are you comfortable changing his vision?" Penelope was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think Papa would approve. He built this inn to serve the community and provide for his family. Expanding does both those things. Besides, he always said a building should grow with the needs of its people, not trap them in what was." "Then let's do it." Preston closed the ledger and pulled her into his arms. "We'll need to hire more help, plan carefully so we don't overextend ourselves. But if anyone can make it work, it's us." "Us," Penelope repeated, smiling against his chest. "I like the sound of that. We've always been strongest together." "You're the partner I always needed," Preston said, deliberately echoing her words from years ago. "The one who made me want to be more than I was. And you're mine. The one who saved me when I was drowning and then taught me to swim." She pulled back to look up at him. "Preston, do you realize we've been together for almost 9 years now? It feels like both forever and no time at all." "I know exactly what you mean." He kissed her forehead, her nose, her lips. "Every day with you feels like a gift I don't quite deserve but am grateful for anyway. You deserve every bit of happiness we have. You worked for it, fought for it, built it with your own hands." Penelope's voice was fierce. "Don't ever think otherwise." They made love that night with the tenderness of long familiarity, but also the passion that had never quite faded. Afterward, as Penelope slept in his arms, Preston lay awake, listening to the sounds of the inn settling around them. Somewhere down the hall, one of the twins called out in his sleep, and Preston heard the soft padding of Peter's feet as the older boy went to comfort his brother. The sound of his son's gentle murmuring, soothing James or Joseph back to sleep, made Preston's throat tight with pride. This was his legacy, he realized. Not just the inn they'd saved and improved, not just the work he'd done throughout the community, but these children they'd raised to be kind and capable. Peter with his careful planning and gentle strength. Pauline with her quick mind and generous heart. The twins with their exuberance and infectious joy. They were good kids, growing into good people, and that mattered more than anything else. The expansion took a full year to complete. Preston oversaw the construction himself, working alongside Thomas and a crew of local men he trusted. They built with care and quality, using the best materials they could afford and refusing to cut corners. The addition blended seamlessly with the original structure, honoring what had been while embracing what could be. The grand reopening was a community celebration. Nearly the entire town turned out, along with regular guests who'd become friends over the years. Mrs. Harrington, now elderly but still sharp as a tack, gave a speech about perseverance and the importance of supporting local businesses. Reverend Worth blessed the new building. And Preston and Penelope stood together, their children arrayed around them, and welcomed everyone to explore the expanded inn. "Your father would be so proud," Mrs. Harrington told Penelope, gripping her hand with surprising strength. "You didn't just save what he built, you made it better." "We made it better," Penelope corrected, looking at Preston with such love that he felt his face heat. "I couldn't have done any of this without my husband. That's true partnership right there." Mrs. Harrington nodded approvingly. "You're lucky to have each other." "We know," Preston said, pulling Penelope close. "Believe me, we know." That night, after the celebration ended and the guests departed, after the children were tucked into bed and the inn was dark and quiet, Preston and Penelope walked through the new rooms together. Their footsteps echoed on the fresh floorboards, and the smell of new wood and paint hung in the air. "It's really done," Penelope whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell. "We really did this. We did, and it's just the beginning." Preston stopped in the center of what would be the new dining room, pulling Penelope to face him. "I have something for you. Preston, we just spent all our spare money on this expansion. You shouldn't have gotten me anything. It didn't cost money." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I've been working on this for months. Open it." Penelope unfolded the paper with trembling hands, then gasped. It was a drawing, beautifully detailed, showing the inn as it now stood but with additional flourishes. A garden with paths and benches, a playground for children, a stable for guests' horses, and in the corner a small house. "That's for us," Preston explained, pointing to the house. "If we built that, we could turn our current quarters into more guest rooms, but we'd have our own space too, a real home just for our family. What do you think?" "I think it's perfect." Penelope's eyes filled with tears. "Preston, you've thought of everything." "I've had a lot of time to think about what would make this place perfect, what would serve our family and our guests. This is my dream for the future if you'll share it with me. Always." She threw her arms around his neck, the drawing crinkling between them. "I'll always share your dreams, just like you've always shared mine." They stood there in the empty room, holding each other. Two people who'd found each other in unlikely circumstances and built something extraordinary together. Outside, the town of Knights Ferry slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that the inn at the heart of their community was safe and thriving. And inside the inn, the Eddington family's dreams continued to grow and flourish, rooted in love and watered by partnership. The years that followed brought both joy and challenges. The small house was built, giving the family private space while allowing the inn to expand further. Peter, as he grew into adolescence, showed real talent for design and construction, working alongside his father on projects throughout the region. Pauline developed her mother's head for business, helping to manage the inn's accounts and guest relations with impressive maturity. The twins, impossible to separate, became the inn's unofficial welcome committee, charming guests and livening up every gathering. When Peter was 15, a man rode into town who made Preston's blood run cold. He was older now, the scar on his face more pronounced, but Preston recognized him immediately as the leader of the men who'd threatened Penelope years ago. Scarface didn't seem to recognize Preston at first, simply requesting a room at the inn with tired courtesy that suggested he'd fallen on hard times. Preston pulled Penelope aside before she could respond to the request. "That's one of the men from that night, remember? The ones who threatened you." Penelope studied the man more carefully, and Preston saw recognition dawn in her eyes. "You're right. What should we do?" "That's your call. This is your inn, but I'll back whatever decision you make." Penelope was quiet for a long moment, studying the man who stood in her lobby, hat in hand, looking nothing like the swaggering bully from years past. Finally, she approached him with her professional smile in place. "I have a room available. Same rate as always, and supper is served at 6 if you'd like to join us." The man looked surprised. "Thank you, madam. That's very kind." As he climbed the stairs, key in hand, Preston moved to his wife's side. "You sure about this? People change, Preston. You did. Maybe he has too." She squeezed his hand. "Besides, what kind of innkeeper would I be if I turned away someone who needs help? Even if he doesn't deserve it, showing grace costs us nothing." Preston marveled once again at his wife's capacity for forgiveness. He wasn't sure he could have made the same choice, but he trusted her judgment. They kept a careful eye on their guest that evening at supper, but the man was quiet and polite, keeping to himself. He left the next morning with a sincere thank you and a generous payment that suggested he'd come into better circumstances than his worn appearance indicated. "Did you see his face when you showed him kindness?" Preston asked after the man had gone. "I think you surprised him. Good. Maybe it'll make him think twice before threatening someone again." Penelope smiled slightly. "Or maybe I'm just foolish and idealistic. You're neither of those things. You're grace personified, and I love you for it." Life continued its steady rhythm. Peter eventually went off to study architecture in San Francisco, surprising no one with his choice. He wrote long letters home, filling pages with drawings and descriptions of buildings that made Preston's chest swell with pride. Pauline took over more of the inn's daily operations, revealing a talent for hospitality that matched her mother's. The twins, now young teenagers, helped with maintenance and groundskeeping, their energy finally channeled into productive work. On Preston's 40th birthday, Penelope organized a surprise celebration at the inn. Friends and neighbors filled the expanded dining room, along with regular guests who'd become like family over the years. Peter came home from San Francisco for the occasion, a young man now rather than a boy, full of ideas and ambition. The twins presented their father with a hand-tooled leather belt they'd saved up to buy. Pauline gave him a book of Robert Browning poetry, knowing her father's secret love of verse. But it was Penelope's gift that brought tears to his eyes. She presented him with a photograph in a beautiful wooden frame. It showed the inn as it had looked when Preston first arrived, taken from an old tintype her father had commissioned. Beside it, in the same frame, was a recent photograph showing the inn as it now stood, expanded, improved, thriving. "This is your legacy," Penelope said softly, so only he could hear. "You took something broken and made it whole. You saved more than just a building, Preston. You saved me. You saved this family. You saved an entire community's gathering place." "We did it together," Preston insisted, his voice rough. "I was just the hammer. You were the blueprint, the vision that made it all possible. Then we're the perfect team." She kissed him softly, unconcerned about their audience. "Here's to 40 more years of building together." The party continued late into the night, filled with laughter and music and the warmth of community. Preston looked around at all these people who'd become part of his life, who knew him and accepted him, and felt overwhelmed by gratitude. He thought about the man he'd been when he rode into Knights Ferry 17 years ago, hollow and directionless, and couldn't quite reconcile that person with who he was now. "You look contemplative," Reverend Worth said, appearing at Preston's elbow with a glass of whiskey for each of them. "Birthdays will do that to a man. Just thinking about how much has changed, how much I've changed. You've become a pillar of this community, Preston. A man people look to for guidance and help. Your father would be proud wherever he is." Preston accepted the whiskey and took a sip, savoring the burn. "I hope so. I spent so many years running from his memory, from the responsibility of living up to his example. Turns out the only way to honor him was to stop running and build something worth building. That's wisdom right there. And you've built something extraordinary." The Reverend gestured around the room. "Not just this inn, though that's impressive, but a family, a life, a legacy of generosity and hard work. That's what matters in the end." After Reverend Worth moved away, Peter approached his father. At 21, he stood as tall as Preston now, with the same dark hair and serious eyes but his mother's expressive mouth. "Can we talk outside for a moment, Papa?" Curious, Preston followed his son onto the porch. The autumn night was cool, stars brilliant overhead in the clear sky. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before Peter spoke. "I've been offered a partnership in an architectural firm in San Francisco. It's a good opportunity, Chance to work on important buildings and make a real name for myself. Pride surged in Preston's chest. That's wonderful, son. Congratulations. But I wanted to talk to you before I accepted. I know the plan was always for me to come back here eventually, to help run the inn and take it over someday. If I take this partnership, that might not happen, at least not for many years. Preston put his hand on his son's shoulder. Peter, the inn was never meant to be a cage. Your mother and I want you to pursue your dreams wherever they lead. If that's San Francisco and architecture, then that's what you should do. You're not disappointed. How could I be disappointed? You're following your passion, using your talents to their fullest. That's all any parent wants for their child. Preston smiled. Besides, Pauline is more than capable of running this place when the time comes. She has a better head for business than I ever did. Peter visibly relaxed. Thank you, Papa. I was so worried about letting you down. Son, you could never let me down. I'm proud of you every single day. Preston pulled Peter into a hug, this young man who'd been a baby in his arms such a short time ago. Go to San Francisco, build beautiful things. Live a life that matters. Just promise you'll visit home often. I promise. Peter's voice was muffled against Preston's shoulder. And Papa, thank you for everything you've taught me, about building, about integrity, about being a good man. I wouldn't be who I am without your example. Now it was Preston's turn to feel his eyes sting. That means more to me than you know. They returned to the party, and Preston found Penelope watching them with knowing eyes. She came to his side, slipping her hand into his. He told you about San Francisco. You knew, of course. I'm his mother, she smiled. Are you all right with it? I'm more than all right. I'm proud. Preston squeezed her hand. We raised him to fly, Penelope. Can't complain when he spreads his wings. No, we can't. She rested her head against his shoulder. But I'll miss him. Me too. But we still have 3 more at home, and I have a feeling they're going to keep us plenty busy. The years proved him right. Pauline took over more of the inn's operations as Penelope's arthritis began to slow her down, managing everything with impressive efficiency. The twins eventually split up, with James going to work for the railroad and Joseph staying local, taking over Preston's carpentry and repair business. More grandchildren arrived as the children married and started families of their own, filling the inn and the small house with noise and laughter. Preston's hair turned gray, then white. His back ached on cold mornings, and he couldn't work as long or as hard as he once had. But he still rose early most days, still found projects to occupy his hands, still looked for ways to be useful. Penelope's auburn hair silvered beautifully, and her face gained lines that spoke of laughter more than sorrow. They settled into the comfortable rhythms of long marriage, still in love but in a deeper, quieter way than the passionate beginning. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered for a celebration. Peter came from San Francisco with his wife and 3 children. Pauline closed the inn for the day, something she almost never did, to focus entirely on the family gathering. James brought his railroad stories, and Joseph brought a rocking chair he'd built especially for the occasion. They gathered in the backyard of the small house, tables laden with food and children running everywhere. Preston sat in his new rocking chair with Penelope beside him in her own, watching the chaos with contentment. 30 years, Penelope mused. Where did the time go? Into all of this. Preston gestured at the scene before them. Into these children and grandchildren. Into the inn and the community. Into building a life that matters. You have any regrets? Preston thought about it seriously, as he always did when she asked important questions. Not a one. Well, maybe I wish I'd found you sooner, had more years with you, but I wouldn't change anything else. Not even the hard times, the struggles and setbacks, especially not those. They made us stronger, taught us what we were capable of. He reached for her hand, their fingers interlacing with practiced ease. Besides, the hard times made the good times sweeter, made us appreciate what we had. You're a wise man, Preston Eddington. I'm a lucky man, married to an extraordinary woman. Paulin approached with 2 glasses of champagne. Time for a toast. Come on, you two. Stand up so everyone can see you. Preston helped Penelope to her feet, and together they faced their assembled family. The conversations died down, all eyes turning to the couple who'd built this life, this legacy. 30 years ago, Peter said, stepping forward as the eldest, a dusty cowboy rode into Knights Ferry looking for work and a place to rest. He found an innkeeper who needed help, and together they built something extraordinary. Not just a successful business, though they did that, but a family, a home, a center of community. They showed all of us what real partnership looks like, what it means to fight for what matters and never give up. They taught us about love, Paulin added. Not the easy, romantic kind you read about in books, though they have that too. But the hard kind, the kind that shows up every day and does the work. The kind that weathers storms and celebrates victories and keeps choosing each other over and over again. They gave us roots, James said, a place to belong and return to no matter how far we roam. And wings, Joseph finished, the courage to pursue our own dreams because we saw them pursue theirs. Preston felt his throat tighten with emotion as his children spoke. He looked at Penelope and saw tears streaming down her face, though she was smiling. We didn't do anything special, Preston said, his voice carrying across the yard. We just loved each other and worked hard and tried to do right by the people around us. If that created something meaningful, we're grateful. But the real gift has been all of you. You children who have made us proud every single day, and these grandchildren who remind us why building a future matters. I want to say something too, Penelope said, her voice wavering slightly. She cleared her throat and continued stronger. When I met Preston, I was drowning. I'd lost everything that mattered, and I was holding on by my fingernails to the last piece of my father's legacy. I thought I needed help with repairs, but what I really needed was a partner. Someone who would stand beside me, shoulder the burden with me, celebrate the victories with me. Preston became that partner and so much more. She turned to face him fully, ignoring their audience. You're the partner I always needed, Preston Eddington, the one I didn't dare hope existed. You saved me in every way a person can be saved, and you've made every day since an adventure I'm grateful to live. I love you now more than ever, and I'll love you until my last breath. Preston pulled her into his arms, kissing her thoroughly despite the whoops and cheers from their children and grandchildren. When they broke apart, both were laughing through their tears. To 30 more years, Preston said, raising his glass. To 30 more years, the family echoed, voices rising in joyful chorus. The celebration continued as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded Preston of that first day he'd seen Knights Ferry from the ridge. So much had changed since then, yet the mountains remained eternal, the river still flowed, and the inn still stood strong. As darkness fell and the party moved inside, Preston and Penelope stayed in the yard for a moment longer, sitting close in their rocking chairs and watching the stars emerge. Thank you, Preston said softly. For what? For taking a chance on a drifter with nothing to his name, for seeing something in me worth saving, for building this life with me. He squeezed her hand. For everything. Thank you for staying. For fighting for us when it would have been easier to leave. For being the man I always knew you could be. Penelope brought his hand to her lips and kissed it gently. For loving me so well. They sat in companionable silence, listening to the sounds of their family inside. the laughter and conversation that spoke of love and connection. This was what they'd built, Preston thought. Not just structures of wood and stone, but bonds of love that would outlast them both. A legacy not of things but of relationships, of values passed down, of lessons learned and shared. The Knights Ferry Inn would stand long after they were gone, but more importantly, their children and grandchildren would carry forward what they'd taught. The value of hard work, the importance of community, the power of partnership, and above all, the transformative nature of love that chooses to stay rather than run. Preston Eddington had spent his youth running from himself, but he'd spent his adulthood running toward something better. And in the arms of Penelope Jenkins, he'd found not just a destination but a home in the truest sense of the word. Not a place but a person. Not walls but a heart that welcomed him in and never asked him to leave. As they rose to join their family inside, Preston took one last look at the inn, its windows glowing warm in the darkness. Then he followed Penelope into the light, into the warmth, into the love they'd built together one day, one choice, one act of staying at a time. And in that moment, he knew with absolute certainty that his life had been exactly what it needed to be. A journey from loneliness to belonging, from drifting to rootedness, from running to home.